Hello, and welcome to our webinar, Hot or Not, How to Navigate Your Current Rental Market and Prepare for the Future. My name is Maria, and I'm with Zillow Group Rentals. I'll start first with a few housekeeping tips. You are in listen-only mode. If you can see the presentation and hear me, you are in the right place. If you have any technical issues at any point during the presentation, please contact the Technical Support Center at 866-678-2846. Be sure to reference our webcast title today, Hot or Not, How to Navigate Your Current Rental Market. I also want to let you know the webinar will be recorded and sent to all registrants after the webinar. If you get disconnected for any reason, don't worry, you'll have a copy sent to you directly. Also, thank you to everyone who sent in questions ahead of time. We have well over 1,000 attendees dialed in today, so we won't be able to answer everyone's questions. We do prepare questions ahead of time, and we'll do our best to follow up with questions after. Please understand, though, the sheer number of attendees makes it difficult to get to everyone. I'll introduce Skylar in a minute, but first I want to say a little bit more about Zillow Group Rentals. What is Zillow Group? Zillow Group encompasses 3 primary consumer rental brands, including Zillow, Trulia, and HotPads. As a landlord, you can use Zillow Rental Manager to create one listing that's posted on all 3 sites. The Zillow Group network of rental sites is double the size of any other rental network. We have over 7 million qualified renters searching our sites, and a renter searching across Zillow Group is more likely to have a credit score in the 600 to 700 range, is ready to move in within a month or sooner, and provides enough information up front for landlords to determine next steps. Save time when you know which contacts are the most qualified. Also, don't forget to check out our Rental Resource Center. An invaluable resource to landlords and property managers of all types, our Resource Center includes information for first-time landlords as well as seasoned veterans. In addition, you can find our whole library of prior webcasts. So if you want to know how to deal with a problem tenant, hear Skylar's predictions for all of 2018, and more, you can go to the webcast part of our Rental Resource Center. If you have 50 or more units, you can now go or email rentalpartners@zillowgroup.com or visit the Multifamily Knowledge Center. This is for property managers of large communities and multifamily marketers. We have dedicated business consultants to provide custom advice based on your individual goals. Again, you can email us at rentalpartners@zillowgroup.com or visit our Multifamily Knowledge Center for more information. Once again, this webinar is being recorded, and now I'll introduce our presenter, Senior Economist Skylar Olson. Welcome, Skylar.
Thank you for having me. All right. Let's see. So I am, senior economist here at Zillow. What that means is that I have a wonderful opportunity to play with a lot of the data that Zillow has access to, that you, in putting your listings on Zillow, are able to provide. And then, of course, we combine that with all sorts of outside data sets to really explain what's happening in housing markets across the country, both nationally and locally. And it's my great pleasure to have the opportunity to share those kinds of insights and that kind of data to people who could actually use it and are participating in the market on a daily basis. So thank you so much for having me, and I'll jump right in. If any of you have participated in these webinars before, or seen me speak, that one of the ways I always like to start is as national and high level as possible, just to look at overarching rent trends, right? So what you see in front of you here, this is our flagship metric for rent, basically to talk about how rent is growing over time. What you see in front of you is that blue line. This is the Zillow Rent Index. What's important to know about the Zillow Rent Index is that it's different from looking at, say, a median rent list price, right? And what makes it very different is what I'm doing is I'm actually taking what we first do is we estimate what rent would be on every property that we have on our site. Right? And the way that we do that is we take rental listings and that listed rent price, and we use advanced machine learning techniques in order to combine that information. Basically, what does an extra bedroom mean in terms of greater rent? What does an extra square foot mean in terms of greater rent, and what is the value of the location? Once I have that kind of relationship, once I have that kind of model, I can apply it to all homes, not even the ones that have rented recently. And what that enables me to do is take the median across a fixed set of housing, and that when I follow that median through time, what I'm doing is I'm really isolating just the price effects. This is important because if I look at a median rented list price, it'll jump around a lot, right? Because one month maybe more one-bedroom units are listed. The next month maybe it's more downtown units versus out in the burbs. And that can make things really volatile because what's changing is not just how is rent growing over time, but the types of homes that are being listed. So what I'm doing here is I'm isolating to rent, and then I can start talking about what's happening to rent itself, what's happening to prices. So pay attention to the green line because this is a really good one to look at here. This is how rent has changed over time. This is basically year-over-year changes to the blue line. And what this line shows me is that rent is increasing again, right, in terms of speeding up the pace, right? So picking up the pace, rent is growing faster and faster again. You can see that from the end of that green line in its upward slope, okay? Now, rent hit its heyday in terms of how fast it was moving in mid-2015 and then slowed down a lot because we had all this new supply coming on, mostly in multifamily, that really took the pressure off of a lot of that demand pressure. If you've seen previous webinars with me, that's been a big theme of what we've talked about. Today, I'll focus a little bit on that, but touch on some other elements as well. The big takeaway here is that nationally rent is moving at 2.8%, which is pretty fast again in terms of a national number. That's a fairly aggressive pace of rent growth or rental housing inflation. It's even faster if I look at certain areas, okay? So this next line, or this next graph, what I'm showing here is the annual appreciation from last February to this February in rent. Again, what we're doing is we're just looking at rent itself, so we're controlling for the property mix. I'm looking at the same set of properties over time. And I'm looking at different major metropolitan areas across the country. When I say metropolitan areas, these are generally collections of counties. So it's not the cities themselves, right? It's the larger metropolitan area. If I look at cities themselves, often downtowns, or closer into the urban core can be where rent is moving even faster. And in other areas, it's the burbs where rent is moving much faster. And I'll show you that in a second later on. But right now, just comparing across major metropolitan areas, I can see there is a wide diversity of what's happening in rental markets, okay? So I can be looking, for example, at Pittsburgh, at Austin, where rent has actually, at the median, been flatlined around zero. Or I can look at places like Sacramento, California, where rent is moving at 8.2% year over year, which is nuts. That's actually an incredibly fast pace of rent growth. Atlanta, Georgia as well, moving very quickly at 4.4%. And of course, Seattle, which has been at the top of our list for many years now, moving at 4.9%. Okay, so these are very hot markets in terms of the pressure that's being placed on rent. And by a hot market, I'm often focusing on price as a signal, right? If you remember back from your Econ 101 days, if you took Econ 101, or if you haven't blocked it completely from your memory because it didn't traumatize you that much, right? You'll remember this whole supply and demand thing, right? If I have limited supply and a lot of demand coming into an area, that's going to put a lot of pressure on rent, and it's going to make things very competitive, and things are going to really be changing pretty quickly. Now, if I look at those dynamics over time, I can see that this is actually not as hot as it has been. Nationally, things are certainly heating up, and in some markets, things are heating up really significantly, and it's been a big change over the past year, where things they had slowed down, but now they're speeding up again as more demand is coming online, and as supply really hasn't been able to catch up. But at least it's not as crazy as it was in the past. So, for example, if I look at that orange line, okay, the one that really hits a crescendo close to 20%, that's San Francisco, right? San Francisco was a crazy rental market in 2015, but they weren't alone in how crazy they were, right? Denver was also pretty wild. Seattle also fairly aggressive during this time period. And they had since, slowed down significantly leading into 2017. A lot of that, again, was all this new supply coming online from multifamily. But then over the past year, we've seen a lot of these markets start to speed up again. So San Francisco, actually rents started to drop a little bit. Now they've come back up. They're still dropping, but they're not dropping nearly as fast as they were. Then we've got places like Seattle that have slowed down significantly, but still at a fairly fast pace. Then you've got areas like Chicago, which have come back up from a negative pace and now are flatlining again. Again, there are a lot of different kind of dynamics and experiences that are going on in major metropolitan areas all across the country, and kind of what's moving those things have a lot to do with job growth, has a lot to do with supply, and those two things combined together are really driving the market.
So, Skylar, when you're talking about this variance and driving the market, do you mean the rental price, or do you mean the rentals available, or is it a combination thereof?
Well, it's always a combination thereof, right? Because what's going to determine the price and what's happening to prices are always what's available relative to the demand and people looking for it. Now, I'll be able to really drive home that point in a second when we get to some of the other slides. But when I talk about heat, what makes a hot market, if I'm looking at it in just this current time period, right, what I'm really focusing on is where's the pressure. How do I notice where the pressure is where prices are increasing the fastest, right? Now, again, we'll see in a couple of slides just how much it matters, how much supply there is relative to demand for what drives that price. So just another thing to kind of remark on, that's related to all of this, right? When I have fast price growth, a lot of it is because there isn't a lot of supply relative to demand, and that pushes vacancy rates down. A thing to recognize here is that vacancy rates, have been steadily decreasing, but though they've now, the good news on this slide for the typical renter is that they've stabilized. Also, that can be good for the typical landlord too, and that what your experiences are could potentially have stabilized as well, right? So which makes it easier for planning, right, and determining how your business will be moving forward. It's a little bit different in the West, which is that lightest blue line, where vacancy rates are low, but more volatile and has since started, picking up. And you can see that, remember when we were talking about San Francisco, rents have started to fall again, or continue to fall, right? There's just not as much pressure as they were before. At the end of this presentation, we'll talk about what's driving some of that. Some of it is a flight from really expensive areas to affordability in terms of just what's driving markets now and into the future. But okay, so let's talk about this drivers of heat today. So again, strong demand, non-responsive supply. So let's start with an example. Okay, now what I've got in front of us here, these are cities across the Boston metropolitan area. Okay, so here I've got this big Boston metro, and each dot is a city. Okay, if you want to focus on the left first, what this metric is showing us is the number of page views on rental listings per day. So how many times does a rental listing, like, the average rental listing in this city, get looked at per day? Okay, and notice there's this pretty big variance, right? And what's happening is I can kind of notice a general trend here where I've got lighter dots in the middle, right, towards these more central metropolitan cities, and darker dots on the periphery, right, where there's more views per listing per day as I move out from basically the metropolitan core, okay? Now, notice that I can kind of see that reflected in rent growth as well, right? I can, it's not a perfect relationship, but the areas, if I look on the right, where rent growth is the strongest, right, it's also, some of those clustered, close-in cities that don't see as much views per day, right, per listing per day, are not growing quite as quickly, whereas those that see a lot of views per day, rent still has a lot of pressure on, right? A lot of pressure is happening. Now, there are a few things going on here, okay? One of the things that we can look at is just how many active rental listings there are. So here I've zoomed in to the core, right? So it's kind of these core cities, but now each dot represents a neighborhood. So if you kind of get the idea of the scale of the zoom, here I had, the full, this is the full Boston metropolitan area, so very large, lots of cities. And you can see that I'm zooming in here, right, to more, there are multiple cities here in this cluster. This isn't just Boston, but it's kind of the closer in cities around Boston and then the neighborhoods that are defined around it, okay? Okay, so each dot is a neighborhood, and what these colors represent are the number of active rental listings by neighborhood, okay? So notice, I'm going to toggle back and forth a couple of times, but notice I've got darker dots in closer to the metropolitan core, right? Neighborhoods that are really in the more urban areas and urban spaces, there are more active rental listings. And so if I look at the left up here again, that kind of matches this idea of I'm not getting as many views per page. There's not as much competition for those rental units, in terms of people looking for rental units, shopping for rental units per unit, right? So not as many views per unit in that tighter cluster area, right? And a lot of that has to do with the fact that there's just more possibilities, right? I'm spreading people out across more rental listings. Now, this is a pretty common experience that's happening in major metropolitan areas across the U.S., and one of the reasons why I tend to see, darker dots here, more active rental units closer into the core, is because we've been able to build more multifamily than single-family homes, right? So neighborhoods that are more dense, that are more multifamily dominant, this is where I've been able to see more supply, and that's taken the pressure off of rents, and that takes the pressure off the competition. Okay, here I can see this in a national picture that this is actually a common experience. So check out the blue line. This is our permits, so new construction permits, right, dedicated to one-unit homes. So notice it hit a crescendo, during the housing bubble in 2005, 2006, right? So that blue line really hit its peak. And then plummeted, right? We just stopped building with the housing crash. Now, single-family permits have since increased steadily and slowly, but notice the level where we're currently at. Okay, if I trace it back and compare it to before, I'm still not building single-family units at the rate seen in the 90s, right? Forget about the bubble, right? Just go back to the 90s. Mid-90s kind of era, and I'm not building even at that level yet. Okay, so single-family construction has really not picked up at the same time that household formation has, right? People coming online searching for housing has most certainly picked up. There are more and more people who are looking, to form households. You form a household by, moving out on your own instead of living with your parents anymore, and so by aging into that stage of life, right? You also form a household if you get divorced. You form a household lots of different ways, but household formation is something economists look at a lot relative to housing construction to see where the pressure is. Okay, now on the flip side, check out green. This is the number of units in structures with 5+ unit buildings. So these are buildings that are generally built more in urban areas, already in dense locations. We have a really hard time building 5+ units in areas that are single-family dominant, right, for reasons of land use and zoning and things like that. And we'll show that in a slide in a second. But notice that in green, we're at where we were in the 90s. We are beyond where we were in the 90s, right? We're building multifamily at a pretty good clip now relative to what we have done in the past. And in 2015, when rent was going nuts, the market responded by providing more rental units, right? Or filing permits for more rental units in multifamily buildings, okay? So the response was there. Unfortunately, the response has been very concentrated, right? Because I can only build density where things are already dense, okay? And a lot of that has to do with the fact of just land use controls, right, and local restrictions and NIMBYism, right, not in my backyard. These are very strong determinants of what we can and can't do in terms of how our built environment evolves. So when I'm looking at a graph in front of me here, what's on the bottom axis is the annual change in the number of households. So think of this as household formation, right? More people need homes. And then on the left axis is the annual change in rents. Okay. Now, as I go to the right to orange, these are the cities. Every dot here is a city. These are the cities where there are the most restrictions on land use, whether that means more of the city is zoned for single family, or you need a higher share of city council members in order to approve building permits. The wait time for building permits is longer. There are greater restrictions on lot size, things like that, all combined into being more restrictions. And as you can see, if I have more restrictions and as I get more people, I see more of a response in rents. So it's the same idea of if supply can't really evolve or change, like I'm having a hard time building more single family units, I'm having a harder time building more multifamily units in the periphery, that's all going to combine to, I've got a lot of supply now in a concentrated space. That took the pressure off of rent growth, and yet, demand is also at play here. So what's happening to demand? And this is a nice thing to consider too when we think long term, but it's also happening now. So we saw in one of the previous slides that, and actually, let me start here real quick, just so we get these average trends, that multifamily homes are actually don't have as much rent appreciation right now, don't have as much pressure on price, right, and that's driven through relative demand and supply, than single family homes, right? And a lot of that has to do with we're not building it, right? So we showed that we're not building single family homes as fast. This is still rent for both single family and multifamily. So we're not building single-family homes as fast, but it's also the case that demand is going more and more in that direction, right? That more and more people are actually looking to rent single-family houses. So why might I make that argument? Where do I think that's coming from? Now, part of a thing to consider here is that this is the age distribution of the U.S., okay? So if I look at these, that first hill, the first bump on the left, this is the millennial generation, okay? And then I can travel it through. I'm going to pass the green line going right, and that's the boomers, that second hill, okay? Those are the boomers. And then as I continue going right, this is, the silent generation, and the bars are getting shorter because, people don't last forever. So those start decreasing, people, aging and, dying. Okay, so that's how we interpret this graph. That's, the reality of things. Okay. But notice here that in the millennial generation, that first hill, okay, the green line shows me the median age of the first-time home buyer. That's at 33. Okay, people don't really buy homes until they reach their mid-30s, right? And when we make arguments for why people do or don't buy homes, and if you joined us for last webinar, we went into this a lot, right? It has a lot to do with delaying major stages in life, right? Like getting married and having kids. I don't really want to buy a home until I get to that stage, until I need more space, until I need to move further out, right? Well, we also talked last time, and we can talk a little bit more this time if anyone has any questions, about how there's just greater barriers to buying homes. excuse me, like for sale inventory is really constrained. It's hard to save for that down payment, and yet people are aging. We're not building single family homes, right? And yet people are aging into it. So notice that the largest cohort within millennials is still in their early 20s, right? Every year there's going to be more 30-year-olds than the year before. They're moving into this stage of life where they want to be living in single-family homes because they're getting married and having kids. It's hard to buy in that space, whether for affordability reasons, savings reasons, having that down payment, or just finding available inventory to buy and making that long-term match, right? And in the meantime, I'm going to be looking to rent, right? And so renting single-family homes is actually more and more paramount just because of these long-term demographics, too. That's where the demand is going. At the same time, that's not where the supply is going. So here are some other examples. So the Seattle metropolitan area captures this very similar phenomenon. So if I look on the left, I've got four rent page views per listing per day, right? And I can see that closer into the core, these cities have lighter red dots, right? That means there's not as many views per listing that are on Zillow. And then I can see that translate over into annual rent growth, right? I can see that in areas where I have a lot of views per listing, okay, that's where rent's growing faster now, right, as people are moving further out in their interest, but also as we are not adding supply, right? So I've got greater demand relative to supply now further and further out from these cores. This is what's making it so the single-family housing in terms of rent is actually growing faster. There's more pressure. There's more demand relative to supply. Okay. Here's another example, the San Francisco metropolitan area, similar pattern, right? I've got lighter dots closer in, darker dots further out on both metrics. And here's where we're going to change it up a little bit in terms of, where is there not this issue? Well, in a place like Dallas, Fort Worth, major metropolitan area, there's just not, this is not an area that's dominated by the single core, right? So it's a little bit more spread out. You don't see the same kind of cluster issue. And then at a classic sprawl example, here's the Los Angeles metro. Again, not really single core dominant. I see it a little bit, but it's not the same, right? Because it's not single core dominant. I don't have this kind of where there are single family homes versus, a lot of multifamily. Los Angeles is a lot of single family homes, everywhere. I mean, they do have it downtown, but it's a classic sprawl example, right? Okay, so that's really what's driving it most certainly right now. It's inelastic supply. We're not building enough single family at the same time that more and more people are looking to single family homes, whether because they can't buy them or they don't plan to buy them, but they're still reaching that stage of life, right? They're still looking for that greater space. And of course, it's highly supply influenced, right? Where are we actually building, where are we actually supplying more homes? Okay, but if I look at my crystal ball, okay, what is more and more driving people and driving people's decisions? And it's important to recognize that, the economy is really good right now in terms of, job growth is still looking strong, unemployment rates are looking low, wages are finally starting to pick up, the optimism of consumers is still high, right? These are all good things. But because we can't build in housing, prices are increasing faster than that, right? So if I look at what's happening to rent affordability over the long term, that's that green line. What share of your median household income would I expect to pay on rent nationally? This is market rate rent, though, keep in mind, not necessarily what's experienced. I avoid paying market rate rent if I live in substandard housing, if I stick with the same landlord for a long period of time who's, generally landlords increase rent slower for a, current tenant, right? Because they've been good. You don't have to deal with vacancy. Generally you like that tenant. You're more willing, to be, I don't want to say the word nice because you're not being mean to people by offering market rate rent, but you know what I'm saying, to give them a bit of a break. those are all sorts of ways that you can avoid market rate rent as a renter, right? But if I look at market rate rent and how much it takes up of income, so for someone who's moving, who's changing homes, this is much higher than it had historically been in pre-bubble years, right? So the green line is, over the long term, increasing over time. That's not necessarily the same thing for mortgages, right? When I can make that historical comparison, and of course this is almost all driven by interest rates. If I actually look at, the price of homes are more expensive now. For sale homes are more expensive now than they have ever been. Just interest rates still remain so low that the mortgage payment itself is more affordable than it used to be. I know if you've been following anything recently or if you've been buying a home recently, you know that interest rates increased very rapidly over the past 2 months in terms of, the 30-year fixed rate. But in the whole scheme of history, in the past few decades, even where they have increased over the past couple of months, it's still pretty low relative to historic levels in terms of what those interest rates are. So mortgage payments remain pretty affordable. Now, if I take the same idea, let's just look at a bunch of different metropolitan areas. I can see that, that previous picture was a national one, and it hit a lot of places where rent is really affordable. So really unaffordable. So the green guys is the current share out of median household income I would expect to pay on rent, and the gray guy is the historic share. So back before the bubble, pre-2000. And I can see that pretty much everywhere, green is higher than gray. And I can notice, again, that in places like Los Angeles, where there was a lot of dark red dots, right, where rent was growing very quickly, still, that rent burdens are very high. So you would currently expect to pay almost half of your income on rent, okay? Now, it's not just true in Los Angeles that I've seen this distancing from historic, where rent is more unaffordable than it used to be. It's happening in Detroit too, right? It's happening in Dallas too. Even metros that feel affordable compared to other places, right? Other more expensive metropolitan areas are still feeling less affordable to those who have lived there for a longer period of time, right? So everywhere is out. Things are outpacing. One of the exceptions is Baltimore, Maryland, right, where things are still less than what they have been historically in terms of rent. But still, right, it feels more expensive to people who have been there. But we do have cross-metro movers, right? We have people who have an incentive to maybe not live in Los Angeles anymore and try and go to a place that will still offer culture and vibrancy that maybe they've come to enjoy in Los Angeles. Maybe they still want to stick to a sunny place. So they might try out, Denver, still a little colder, but still sunny, right, but more affordable relative. Or maybe they'll try out Austin, right, if they want to make that move. Now, their alternative is to really go affordable, okay? So the list that I have for you here is, if you can get, enough of what you're looking for, you can try Raleigh, North Carolina, right, and moving from Los Angeles to Raleigh, and it would be a huge change, right? So on the left, these are the metropolitan areas that take up still large metropolitan areas, but they take up rent takes up a much smaller share out of median household income than in the metros on the right. Okay, so people making these moves over time, we think, not only are people wanting to make these transitions and changes so that maybe, they can afford to save up for a down payment to buy a home one day, so that they can afford to put their kids through college, so they can afford to save for retirement, right? When you have rent burdens at near 50%, we actually find in, a lot of our analysis that your ability to save drops significantly. People who have rent burdens above, around 40% or above, 2/3 of them save nothing. Nothing meaning nothing, like forget down payment, forget retirement. You're not even saving for emergencies, We find that 50% of Americans 52% of Americans don't have enough savings to cover 3 months worth of expenses, right? So, and it's worse for renters, right? In terms of, when you have a rent burden that's high, like in a place like Los Angeles, Miami, San Diego, San Francisco, New York, it's hard to save, Okay, it's hard to save. And these other metros on the left are viable options. So not only are people thinking about this, right, but companies are thinking about this more and more too. And you can see that when you think about all the hullabaloo people are making about Amazon changing locations, right? So Amazon was in Seattle. Seattle experienced huge record growth, in terms of the cost of housing over the past 3 years. And when you consider a lot of the places that are rising on the tops of people's speculation, lists about where Amazon is going to go, ours in particular, top on our list is Atlanta. And one of the reasons why that is because it is a more affordable place for its workers while still offering high levels of education, good cultural life. And one of the reasons why it's affordable is because it still has opportunity to build and grow and expand, right? It's not overbuilt. Oh, this is that save nothing graph. This is what I was talking about. When your rent burden gets, above 40, that's when we really start to see the share of people who save nothing increase significantly. Before then, it's a bit more stable, right? If I get to 45 or more, 2/3 of people save nothing. That's that graph. How can I see that there is, in general, just on average, for everybody across the U.S., kind of more and more concerns surrounding rental affordability that will be driving people's decisions into the future? Well, this is looking at the share of adults in doubled-up households over time. And, it's not just millennials living with roommates more and more, right? It's not just the story of 4 young adults in New York all living in a 1-bedroom apartment, right? This is for all age groups. We see this happening, where there's just an increase in the share of adults who are doubling up. And by doubling up here, we mean you live in a home with more than one adult, where those adults are not necessarily romantic partners. So they're not married or they're not unmarried partners. It could be your aunt, your sister, your parents, a friend, a roommate. Either way, you're in a doubled up household, and that is increasing over time, right? Now, okay, I might have a flight for affordability over the next, several years. This is a growing concern, right? More and more people are kind of worried about rental affordability. It's impacting their decisions. So where I might expect there to be real opportunity is not just in places that are affordable, but places that are affordable where there's good job growth. So there's, these are growing areas for opportunity, and also income growth. Okay. Now, if I was going to add those two metrics together with affordability into an index, these are the areas that would rank pretty darn well, okay, in terms of where is there pretty solid opportunity for the next several years in terms of you can move there, you can find a job whose income is likely to grow, and it's still affordable, meaning this is a city that's not too congested, that's still able to add housing to accept, greater populations over time. Notice Atlanta, is on our list. I just mentioned them in terms of where we think the next Amazon headquarters are. That'll really fast-track Atlanta. It might fall off this list quickly in terms of no longer affordable, right, because that tends to be what that kind of major investment in a city can do. But you notice that it's joined with a bunch of other areas: Charlotte, North Carolina, Kansas City, Missouri, Indianapolis, Indiana, Minneapolis, Minnesota. These are all different areas where we've got a good ranking on those 3 metrics: affordability, job growth, income growth. Okay, so where might I see opportunities or areas into the future that are potentially hot in 5 years, potentially hot in, it's hard to know how long it takes. Crystal balls are always murky. 2 years, 5 years, a little bit longer, but these are where opportunities are. But I do know that there's already a signal because job growth is happening, right? And job growth often drives population growth, and income growth also can drive, rent, right? People's ability to pay increases over time, and so we see that relationship as well. Okay, so it's not just, if I was to think, okay, where do I want to be a landlord, or where might I expect things to be changing over time? And specifically a single-family landlord, I think, is something to think about here. Well, okay, those were affordable metros where a lot of people may move, and the overall demographics, people are getting older, right? In terms of at least the millennials aging into wanting to live in single-family homes, having kids, having babies, maybe not buying a home yet. Okay, so that's one kind of source of opportunity, right? Is this affordability plus people are aging and wanting to live. Oh, and, you know, and when I say aging, I mean aging into the 30s. There's also this other set that are aging into their retirements. We're just finding one of the big deals, one of the issues about, you know, you can't really buy a home is that people aren't vacating, right? Boomers are not downsizing. That's one of the other reasons why for sale inventory is so constrained. Okay, so, well, what's the other thing that's going to drive someone to rent in a single-family home for longer is that in some places it's the only option, right? Renting a single-family home is the only option because buying a single-family home is fairly prohibitive. So one of the reasons why inventory is low, and actually let's look at the inventory numbers first. So these are for sale inventory numbers. These are the number of homes that are available on average in any given day, and I can see that it's steadily declining over time in all these price buckets. So here I've broken the housing market into 3 categories, low, middle, and top tier by price. And I'm looking to see, well, what's the available inventory in that kind of housing stock over time, and I can see that the bottom and middle tier are lower, right? The drop is more significant than in the top tier, right? So inventory is even more constrained in entry-level housing. Well, one of that reasons is that single-family homes are being rented now at a greater rate, right? A lot of this is just through the course of the housing bubble collapse, right? We've got a lot of foreclosures, and those homes, people didn't have the equity to buy. There was a great opportunity there for a landlord, you know, whether a mom and pop landlord or the greater commercialization of single-family homes that's now kind of driving the market. So more of these single-family homes are being rented, and that is more common. Renting a single-family home is generally concentrated in that bottom tier. Okay, for most major metropolitan areas. So here you see Detroit, St. Louis, Chicago. These are the areas where single-family housing rentals are most certainly concentrated in the bottom tier. Okay. Now, constrained inventory in the for sale market means I'm dual tracking all the time, right? If your listing is on Zillow, you know, the people who are looking at your listings are not just looking for rentals, they're looking at for sale homes as well. People who are looking at for sale homes are also looking at your listings. So this graph, what this means is when I ask all buyers, and these are actually buyers that are not just on Zillow, but buyers in general. This is from a large national consumer survey that we pay to have done. Basically, it says that 52% of buyers at any given time are also...
Due to technical difficulties, the rest of this presentation was cut off in the audio. However, we do have the slides for you to peruse at your own time. We're so sorry about this inconvenience and are working hard to find a solution to give you the best data from Zillow Group every day. Thanks so much for understanding.